Arizona flood insurance. What do you need to know as a homeowner in Arizona? Well, that's exactly what we're going to discuss in today's video. So let's get started. But before we do, remember, share, subscribe, like the channel below. Hi, I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru. More than a decade ago, I bought a house in a flood zone, and guess what? I was told the wrong flood zone. I was told the wrong flood premiums. It had a big impact, and I hope to help you avoid some of those mistakes in this video. Look, of course, this is not the desert here behind me. You can check out some of our other videos up here in the corner that we've shot throughout Arizona. But today we want to talk about Arizona flood insurance. It's an important issue in Arizona, as Arizona actually has more floods than any other state in a given year. Look, you may have seen it reported on the news, but anybody who lives in Arizona knows monsoon season brings with it certain risks like flash flooding. So today we're going to talk about flood zones in Arizona. We're going to talk about flood risks, flood insurance costs, flood insurance options. How much coverage do you need? Is it required in Arizona? Those are just a few things we're going to discuss in this video for Arizona. So first of all, let's talk about Arizona flood zones. You see, Arizona flood zones are completely different really than the rest of the state. Yeah, you've got non-special and special flood hazard areas, and we'll talk about those first. So non-special, remember, will be something like flood zone X, also called minimum risk with the federal government. This is where flood insurance typically is not going to be required if you have a mortgage. Look, that's great news. But do you still need it? Yes. Remember, almost 30% of flood claims actually come out of flood zone X. Now let's talk about special flood hazard areas, and we're talking about things that typically begin with flood zone A in Arizona. You've also got V as in Victor, but these are coastal areas that you don't generally have to worry about in Arizona unless you've had a really bad flood. Now, when we're talking about flood zone A, though, as we mentioned, Arizona is a little different here. Most other states have things like flood zone A and AE. Well, Arizona has typically things like AH and AO. These are different because these are typically canals, sometimes dams that are protecting people where the water will stop. If you live in Arizona in areas like Phoenix, Arizona, Gilbert, then you know how these canals can fill up during monsoon season, which typically is that May to October time frame. And you know that it can happen fast. It doesn't take much. It can take less than half an inch of rain to cause flash flooding in Arizona. I've been there when it's happened. I know. My dad lived in Scottsdale. So it's important that you understand what these different flood zones mean as a homeowner. And we'll dive deeper into requirements later on in this video. Now let's talk about flood risk. First of all, how are flood risk in Arizona different than flood zones? Remember, flood zones are used more from a regulatory standpoint. This means the flood zone may not be updated for 10 years, but a flood risk score could technically change overnight. A flood risk score really gives you a more accurate picture of what the actual risk of your property is like. How close to water are you? Are you in a floodway? Is it river flooding? Is it lake flooding? Is it flash flooding you have to worry about? All these different things. There's a lot of different tools you can use to determine your flood risk score, like riskfactor.com. In the description of this video, you can go to our website. They get your flood risk score off the flood risk tool that we have built for Arizona homeowners like yourself. But remember, the flood risk score too is an overall picture of a 30-year period of chances of your property flooding with a score of 0 to 100. So let's give you a good idea there. Now we talked about flood risk score. We talked about flood zones now. Let's talk a little bit about flood insurance costs in Arizona. Arizona actually has some of the cheapest premiums throughout the country. In fact, just recently, we helped a customer set up a new flood insurance policy for less than $180 a year. You heard me right. Less than $180 a year. Now look, the national average is around $1,000 a year, but in Arizona, we actually see this number closer to the $600 and $700 range in many situations. It depends on your risk in Arizona. Like if you're in Flagstaff, if you're in Tucson or Bisbee, if it's residential, if it's commercial, there's a lot of different factors that we'll talk about too as we get into how flood insurance rates are determined in Arizona. But remember, the National Flood Insurance Program does not use flood zones to determine their rates anymore. However, some private companies still do, but you can kind of take that out of trying to figure out cost. What is going to be the cost of this flood zone? Look, there could be some other costs related that are not premium related, but when it comes to the National Flood Insurance Premium, let's go ahead and throw that one out the window. Now let's talk about your flood insurance options before we get deeper in the cost. And in Arizona, you've got the National Flood Insurance Program, also known as the Federal Flood Insurance Program, and you've got private flood insurance. Look, no matter where you go in Arizona, your National Flood Insurance Program policy should be the same price unless you're taking over someone else's policy, and that's called a policy assumption, where when you go to sell your house, you decide to transfer this policy. I did that. It actually ended up saving me thousands of dollars, so it can help in many situations if it's an older home or an older policy that's been in place at least since about 2020. However, with private flood insurance, rates are all determined differently by each private company, especially if they're a surplus company. Now, the good news is you have what's called some admitted flood insurance policies in Arizona, which is where a lot of these significant savings can happen, but it also gives you more protection if you can go with an admitted policy. Like sometimes a Palomar Insurance offers an admitted policy here in 2024 in Arizona in certain situations. Now let's talk about coverages. The National Flood Insurance Program offers up to $250,000 on your building coverage. That's the actual structure. And they offer up to $100,000 in contents. Now, unfortunately, they don't offer replacement costs on your contents here in 2024. So those are the two coverages with the National Flood Insurance Program. Private flood insurance offers these same coverages as well. The difference, though, is they offer more than $250,000 on your building and more than $100,000 in contents. But let's be honest, have you seen housing in Arizona? Getting a house for less than $250,000 is pretty hard to do in a lot of areas. So just imagine having to rebuild it for that with the way inflation and building costs in Arizona are. Now, when we're looking at premiums, I said, we've talked about flood insurance costs a little bit before in this video with the National Flood Insurance Program pretty much being the same and each private company being different. Let's talk about how rates are built with each one. And let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program first. There's a lot of different things we're looking at. Like you can see right here behind me, they're looking at distance to water. They're looking at elevation, the type of flooding frequency, the replacement cost. This is, if your building has to be destroyed, the actual cost to rebuild it is what they're using when determining their rates. Private companies in Arizona are using these same factors, but they're also using your flood risk score, but they're using one of the factors they have in-house as they model this. And some of these private companies are also still using flood zone. They're using flood loss history on a property. For example, it may disqualify you for a lot of private companies in Arizona versus the National Flood Insurance Program. And so this is how rates are determined with the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance in Arizona. Now remember, the National Flood Insurance Program typically has statutory rate increases of up to 18%. Private though, they could skyrocket your rate next year. So you may get a really good rate this year and next year they decide they're not going to insure that risk anymore. So then you have to go back to the National Flood Insurance Program. If this happens, remember the National Flood Insurance Program has a 30-day wait period. You want to make sure you have that new policy in place, ready to go 30 days before your non-renewal. So these are how the rates and some of the costs with the National Flood Insurance Program and private. Now, private flood insurance offers a third coverage that we haven't talked about yet in this video. They also offer replacement costs on contents, which can be important. But they offer this third coverage called additional living expense or temporary living expense. And I'll tell you a quick story about a homeowner we had in Nebraska who devastated flood in 2018. Her neighbors all had federal policies. She had a private policy with additional living expense. She had a hotel paid for 6 months. This took a big financial strain off her family. She didn't have to worry about the cost. This is some of the benefits that temporary living expense or additional living expense can have. Now, it's important to understand that sometimes it has its own waiting period, usually up to 14 days, and it has its own deductible. But now we're talking about all this stuff in flood insurance in Arizona. Do you really need flood insurance in Arizona? Here's why you need it. Think about this. Does your Arizona home insurance policy cover flood damage? Maybe, maybe not. Let's talk about what exactly is flood damage in Arizona first. And we're talking about either two structures or two parcels, properties that are inundated with water in areas that are normally dry. And we're talking about surface water here, so something from like a river, a lake, that flash flooding event. Typically, most Arizona home insurance policies exclude flood damage. Look, go over to ChatGPT, Claude, put in your policy jacket and ask it to give you your policy exclusions real quick. Or speak with your insurance agent about this when you're trying to figure out the right flood insurance coverages for you. That's something you want to know. But typically, most Arizona home insurance policies are not going to cover flood damage. Now let's talk about how much coverage do you need in Arizona? Look, when we're talking about how much coverage you need, you also want to make sure that you understand replacement cost and actual cash value in Arizona. Let's briefly talk about that. Replacement cost is the actual cost to replace your structure. If you decide to do an actual cash value, which many times is what a National Flood Insurance Program policy could be in many situations, they're going to take out depreciation and some other things as well. This means you may only get 30 to 40% of what the policy is actually for. So you want to be careful about that when you're picking the right flood insurance policy in Arizona. So when you meet with that insurance agent, and now that we're talking about that, let's get into the section on picking the right flood insurance agent in Arizona. Like when you're meeting with them, you want to make sure that they have got access to the National Flood Insurance Program and access to multiple private flood insurance options. You want to make sure they understand the different flood zones, what they mean, whether flood insurance is going to be required or not. What are your bank's requirements? And we'll get into that a little bit more in just a second. You want to make sure that they understand local risk, like maybe local areas that are flood prone that maybe you could avoid using that flood risk score. You want to make sure that they understand maybe how to help you mitigate your property. The benefits of an elevation certificate. Like, is an elevation certificate going to help you in Arizona? It absolutely could. And you can click up here in the corner of this video to watch a deeper dive that we've done on elevation certificates, where we go through everything on them. But remember, elevation certificates are no longer required for flood insurance in Arizona, at least on the national flood insurance level. On some private companies they could be, but they can still be very beneficial. I used one to change my own flood zone more than 10 years ago. So it was extremely valuable valuable for me. So now let's go back to picking that right flood insurance agent. You want to understand that they know how to read an elevation certificate to see if it's going to benefit you or not. You want to make sure that they understand how to advise you on how flood insurance claims, like we talked about earlier in this video, could impact you. These are all important things when picking the right flood insurance agent. So you're probably getting to a point now where you're ready to try to figure out, hey, what's going to be the best solution for your Arizona flood insurance? Is it going to be the National Flood Insurance Program? Is it going to be private flood insurance? Look, these both offer great coverages, as we've talked about. The private can offer higher deductibles. Offer higher coverages and significant savings on premiums. And in many situations, they can offer a quicker claims process. But you want to take a holistic approach to this when you're comparing the two. Don't just look at the bottom number, but look at the actual coverages. Talk to your neighbors and ask them, do you have a National Flood Insurance Program policy? Do you have a private flood insurance policy? What do you like? What do you not like? How have your rates been over the 36-month period? Have they skyrocketed? Because look, we've seen flood insurance costs skyrocketing across the country as widespread flooding happens, like we've seen with Hurricane Helene, Hurricane Debbie in the southeast. We saw many years ago when this all started with Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi and Louisiana. We see with monsoon season the last couple of years that have been pretty bad in Arizona. So these are all things that are important to remember. But at the end of the day, what's important is that you have flood insurance in place to protect your Arizona property. Whether it's a secondary home for you or a primary home, you want to make sure you have the right coverages in place. And that's why I hope today's video has helped you do. But in the description below, you can download our guide on Arizona flood insurance. If you're ready to get a quote on your Arizona property, you can do that down below as well. And it's 3 simple steps. Step 1, fill out the form on our website. Step 2, review your proposal. And step 3, finalize your policy. It's that easy to get protected against flooding in Arizona. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for watching today's video on Arizona flood insurance and what you need to know as a homeowner.